All right, I think we're going to get started. It is a great pleasure to have not just a British election returns party, but actually the first ever transatlantic Harvard election party. And as I just started to mention, this event is being co-hosted with the Harvard Club of the UK. This is the first time we have done events with them, but not simultaneously at the same time in two different places. You can see the conference room there at Freshfields. The gentleman on the screen is Don Guiney, my friend and colleague, who is also the head of the Harvard Club of the UK. Don, do you want to just do a slight pan around the room so that we can see what's going on there?
Let's see if we can, if our cameraman can pan around. We look like we had 80 people signed up. I think we've probably got about half of those people here, which is about typical, but people will continue to drift in. While we don't have fancy election posters like you do, we do have color-coordinated cupcakes that have been frosted in the colors of the three largest parties. We do not have green cupcakes or UK Independence Party cupcakes, but we do have Tory, Labour, and Liberal Democrat cupcakes. So perhaps that will take a straw poll and see who's left.
Excellent.
When we're done.
All right. So the events for today are our first event is we're going to have a debate of students who have agreed to present the platforms of the three major parties. I should say that this event is also, in addition to being a joint event with the cupcakes. In addition to being a joint event with the Harvard Club of the UK, we're also extremely pleased to be co-producing this event with the Undergraduate Club of Britain. So, and they have very kindly agreed to give us a rundown on the platforms of the party. So I'm going to now turn that over to the panel. After the panel, we will have our sort of panel of experts, which is a faculty panel from here, and I'm also happy to say coming from Freshfields. Jim Alt from the Government Department, who is spending the month at Oxford, has come down to London, and he will be one of our panelists, along with Peter Hall from the Government Department and Dick Rosecrance from the Kennedy School. All right, so let me first introduce Aaron Dearden, who is the Vice President of the Harvard College British Club. He is a junior. He's a physics concentrator. He still has one paper left to hand in before he gets to go home for the year. And he will moderate the panel and introduce our panelists. So, Aaron, thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. So thank you all for coming this afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are in London at the moment. So this year's campaign has been very interesting for me. It's certainly been the closest run campaign that I remember, and the possibility of hung parliament is very interesting. Okay, so one of the new features of this year's campaign has been the TV debates. This is for those of you who aren't familiar with it. We don't normally have TV debates before our elections, but this was the first year that occurred. And this really, helped to bring kind of the policies to the public. And so we're going to try and replicate some of that excitement with the three students that we've got here with us today. So first of all, we're going to have Manny Antunes, who's going to be representing Labour. He's actually an American citizen, so he hasn't been voting for Labour today, but this summer he'll be working with Ed Miliband. So he's waiting to see whether he'll be working with a cabinet minister or a shadow cabinet minister. Second of all, we're going to have Albany, and he's going to be representing the Conservatives. He's a sophomore at the moment. He's an engineering concentrator. He's from the Cotswolds, and his area is dominated by the Conservatives. Third up, we've got Josh, and Josh is going to be representing the Liberal Democrats. He's a freshman, yet to declare his concentration, but he's thinking he's going to be Histon Lit. He's from Weston-super-Mare, which is also a Conservative-dominated constituency, but I think there's a chance that the Lib Dems might sneak in there. Okay, so I'm going to now hand over to Manny to talk to you about the Labour Party.
Trish, I think you took one. So unfortunately, I may not be British and as well informed as my British colleagues over here, but I would like to give you a brief overview of the Labour Party's stances on policy, just to show you how the Labour Party is the best party for Britain. And right now, the biggest issue facing, I think, the UK is the economy and the fact that there's a possibility for a double-dip recession. The Labour Party plans on tackling this issue by making targeted increases in budget spending so as to help sustain recovery over the next decade. Once economic growth returns, we plan on cutting the deficit by 50% by 2014. This also means cutting the structural deficit by 2/3. We will also not increase the value-added tax on basic necessities, on food, children's clothing, books, newspapers, and public transportation. We also want to guarantee training or employment to those who have been unemployed for the last 6 months and guarantee job placement for those who have not been employed for the last 2 years. On immigration, we want to continue to tighten the points-based immigration system and introduce a compulsory identity card for all foreign nationals residing in Britain. And we also want to ensure that migrants pass an English test before they come to the UK to reside. On Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, we are still committed for UK involvement in bringing peace and stability to those two regions. Handing over responsibility is one of the most important parts of our policy, and we would like to see the Afghan police and government take over control in their own region. For Europe and foreign affairs, we support the euro in principle, but only through a referendum that will we accept it as the UK national currency. We also support Turkey and Croatia's bid as EU members. And we'd like to reach out to emerging nations like India, Brazil, and China to help develop deeper relationships. And finally, for the environment, we want to work towards creating a global agreement for limiting the rise of the average global temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. We'd also like to cut greenhouse gases by 1/3 across the board by 2020, and by 80% we would like to cut them in 2050. This means also creating new green jobs, about 400,000 of them by 2015, and we would also like to invest in climate change and reduction research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Manny. Next up we're going to have Albany, and Albany's going to be talking about the Conservative Party's policies.
Good afternoon. This election, like any other, is about making a choice. A choice as to not only who we want to govern our country, but also how we want our country governed for the next 5 years. This choice must not, cannot be made lightly, as on this occasion, more than on any other since Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, Britain is in need of the strongest and dynamic, and dare I say it, patriotic government possible. There is also more riding on this election than the immediate and the obvious. For all that we believe in is under attack from every quarter. Freedom of speech, the British way of life, the right to believe whether Christian, Muslim, Hindu or other, and it is not under attack from forces from outside, but from the liberal parties of government, Labour and Liberal Democrats, who in order to keep themselves in power, pander to every minority and create ill-thought-through laws that limit our freedom and allow the forces of coercion to misuse them as and when they wish. Our country is not yet in an irreconcilable mess, but if the problems that are faced by the British people are not addressed quickly and firmly, Great Britain will spiral quickly towards ruin. Now for me, having weighed up all the options, the only party I could vote for that will begin to fulfill the trust of the people is going to benefit the people, and I mean the majority of the British people, and not the interests of narrow vocal minorities, is the Conservative Party. Of course, I recognise the Conservative Party is by no means perfect. It has some wacky and unnecessary ideas, such as allowing voters to elect police commissioners, but beneath the spin and bureaucracy, there is much sense to their manifesto. Within the little blue book that they published, they have clearly set out ways in which they are going to stop the country falling to its knees to grovel once again before the International Monetary Fund, as Greece is doing now, and as Britain did in the 70s under Labour. Isn't it interesting that Britain always seems to develop huge financial problems when it has a Labour government? Only a Conservative government Only a Conservative government will have the bravery and the nerve to take the unpalatable decisions, as they also had to do in the 80s, in order to set the country back on the road to recovery. Now, unlike the Liberal Democrats' manifesto, which just talks about spending billions of pounds on dreamed-up, unrealistic ideas, the Tories are quite open to the public that there needs to be a tax increase in certain areas in order to reduce the deficit to the public purse. At the same time, they realise the importance of promoting British business and banking. For some unexplainable reason, the Liberals and Labour wish to stifle growth of the private sector by increasing national insurance tax rather than promote recovery from the recession. Every party is trying to find different ways of balancing the government's coffers, but it's only the Tories who seem to realise that by drastically increasing tax on those people who provide jobs, you're in actual fact making the country poorer. The way to reduce the deficit is not to tax people, which takes money away from spending and therefore the promotion of business and in turn jobs, and places it into government coffers where it can be wasted. Instead, as the Tories have proposed, the way to reduce the deficit is to control government waste, to rid us of the unelected quangos that waste huge sums of our money and produce little. There are now 1,162 quangos with a total expenditure of £100 billion. Britain's total deficit is £163 billion. So you can see how the Tory plans to cut these will, if deep enough, go a long way towards paying off our debt. Another major issue facing the next government that many people have serious concerns about is immigration. Now, I may be about to be called a bigot by the Labour representative, but I will continue anyway.
I'll let Sue near you.
Immigrants have been flocking into Britain for many years, and this has, I quote from the manifesto, enriched our nation. This is an undeniable fact. From the arrival in the 16th century of 50,000 Huguenots, the various arrivals of Jews fleeing the pogroms of Europe, the West Indians in the 50s, the Ugandan Asians in 1972, and the Vietnamese throughout the 70s, all have brought many benefits to these islands. What these people have in common, however, was the fact that they either their numbers were small or they came over a long period of time, and our crowded island was given time to absorb them into our communities. What is different about our current wave of immigration is the vast numbers arriving in a very short space of time. The country cannot cope through its infrastructure with continued immigration of unskilled workers at the current rate. When current infrastructure breaks down, then this neither benefits those already here, whether long-established or more recent arrivals, nor those who may arrive in the future. Britain must have a breathing space or continue to suffer the effects of over-immigration. Britain is the third most densely populated country in Europe, but this is further complicated as the population is concentrated into a small part of the country. Having said this, it is important to understand that we require the brightest and the best immigrants to keep the private and public sectors thriving. For this reason, David Cameron has said that immigration would be constrained to tens of thousands, which may not be a particularly precise number, but at least it is a start. The other prominent issue at the moment is defence. The British Armed Forces is an institution that our country should be immensely proud of, and that deserves to be treated with the utmost respect. Never again should Britain follow America or any other country into a war without giving our troops the training and equipment that they deserve. The Tories again are the only party who value this great part of our country, and even though they wish to reduce its size and streamline the organisation, they realise the importance of Trident and other such defence systems. All the parties do, however, agree that standard of living for soldiers and their families needs to be higher. But Labour have had their chance to do something about this, and they have failed, especially for our soldiers whose housing stock is in a very poor state of repair. It is important to note that although Labour have failed at this, failed to eliminate boom and bust, failed at improving social mobility, failed at improving crime rate and policing, and failed to improve the health service, all of the current MPs have failed to serve their constituents. It is easy to note the failures of the party in power, but Cameron and his cronies, Clegg and his crew, Brown and his band, have all been serving themselves for many years. Snouts in a trough, they all had their fill at the expense of you and I. And here again, the Tories have the answer. Cut the number of MPs. Why do we need so many freeloaders? Many of them frequently only appear in Parliament to vote. Some have never even made a speech. The gravy train must not continue. The expenses scandal may have blown over, but I am in no doubt that the attitudes have not changed around Westminster. Vote for change, vote for democracy, vote Conservative.
Thank you very much, Albany. Next up, we've got Josh. Josh is representing the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Albany, for that humorous speech. Let's start with some honesty, which has never probably been done before in politics. I wrote this morning, and I'm sick. So good afternoon, Cambridge. Good evening, London. And the first thing I'd like to start with is I wonder what the BBC would say about my tie. Because if you've been following the BBC coverage of this election, we can have daily updates on what the leaders' ties are what ties they're wearing, and how important that clearly is for the election in Britain. And that's the first point I'd like to start off with, that this election has suddenly come into the public eye because of those TV debates we discussed. And we were discussing earlier that 5 weeks ago, there was a poll on the streets of London, and the question, what do you think of Nick Clegg, got the often response of who? But 4 weeks ago, when Nick Clegg stood up on a podium, much like I am today, wearing his yellow tie, he brought into the public eye a new idea of change. Albany talked about change that Conservatives offer. We've talked about change that perhaps the Labour will offer. But really what I'm here to say today is what the reason I put an X, or my mother perhaps put an X for me, thanks Mum, on that ballot paper was because for me, as an 18-year-old student living in America, going back to England when I graduate, the party that I feel will most bring the change to the country that I've lived in all my life is the Liberal Democrats. So, I'd like to start with a little anecdote, that when I was 14 and knew very little about politics, we would discuss politics on history class, and this was the way it was divvied up. The Tories were for the rich, the Labour were for the poor, and the Liberal Democrats, well, no one's going to vote for them. And that's how I was, and I didn't know until 5 weeks ago what I'd be voting on May 6th. And the thing that kind of changed my mind was actually reading the manifestos, and I think what the TV debates have done is brought people to read those manifestos, because there really is confusion as to what these parties stand for. And so I'm going to try and highlight why I agree with Nick, why I agree with the Liberal Democrats, and why I voted Lib Dem this afternoon. So let's look at education. Education is something that's important for most of us here as students, and for all future generations. And my friends certainly who aren't fortunate enough to be at Harvard, who aren't fortunate enough to have generous financial aid packages like Harvard offers, are struggling through debt, through having to get their student loans, and leaving with up to £15,000, £20,000. I can't do the exact change, but I think that's almost like $30,000. And these students are then entering the world with a massive debt over their shoulders. Now, both my colleagues here will say it can't be done, but it's been done. It's happened in the past, and we can get rid of student university fees. But we need to start channeling money in the right direction. Albany put forward a very conservative view, should I say, on the economy. And I personally, I'm not an economist. I'm going to die when you ask me questions about the economy later. But the way I can read the figures is that the whole world is in a dire situation. And for me personally, we need to start investing in things in our society, such as education, public health. We can't let those things go. There are things like quangos that we can let go, but education is an important thing. The Liberal Democrats will scrap the 50% going into university goal, which I think is a very smart thing to do. If university education is going to be free, then we can't have half the British population going to university. But it needs to be made accessible to everyone who wants the opportunity to go. Also, primary education, SATs even, sorry, the standard assessment tests given to 11-year-olds, unnecessary continual bureaucracy of examining our 11-year-olds and our 12-year-olds, putting huge amounts of pressure. And these things need to be changed so that education for younger people can be a more enjoyable experience, and power is put back into the hands of the schools. Another big thing for this election is, as we discussed, the Liberal Democrats have come from obscurity and will hopefully this evening gain a fair proportion of the votes. But that's what they'll gain, a fair proportion, but they won't gain a fair number of seats in Parliament. We're running a system that was created in the 1600s, has had a few electoral reforms since then, and we're now running an extremely unfair election. We may have the Labour Party polling the least percentage of overall votes, but gaining the most number of seats in Parliament. The Tories may only get just over a third of the population agreeing with them, but have a majority. And I think I would stand for most people here when I say that's an unfair system. Whether you agree with Labour or Tory, or even the Lib Dems get a majority this evening, we have a system that does not empower the people. And so we do need electoral reform. But what the Lib Dems are offering is a referendum on that, giving it to the British public. Again, these choices need to be given to the public, and they need to be fair. And what Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats are offering is fairness in politics. We've seen, I can make jokes, I can make comments on the expenses scandal, but many MPs are stepping down because of that reason at this election, and that's what's fair. And what we need to bring fairness back to politics. We need to give the British public a chance to trust their MPs once again. And I think bringing in some form of proportional representation and allowing people to really vote, make their vote count. Aaron said that my constituency was a Tory stronghold, but today, as more students are going out and voting, young people who want to have their voice heard, we could get a Liberal Democrat MP that I really want to see. And hopefully, when we see that 25–30% of the British population want a Liberal Democrat government, then we will have a fair electoral system the next time we come to vote. So we've talked about the economy, we've talked about electoral reform. Another big issue that's come up in all three TV debates is immigration. Now, I'm going to take the difficult task of trying to defend the Liberal Democrat policy of immigration. This is the one I researched in depth because, as many of you will know, the Liberal Democrats are proposing an amnesty on illegal immigrants. Of course, the issue with illegal immigration is we don't know the numbers. We want to put a cap on it, but David Cameron has not given the number of that cap, and Labour really has failed to try and limit our borders. The way I understand it, and the way I think most people should take it, is it's not opening our floodgates. We're not going to say, everyone please come in. We're saying there are people in our system, there are people who are being caught up in gangs, in drug culture, in violence, who are not paying into the system. Why not lift those from these gangs? Why not get them paying into the system? Why not have them educated so that they can commit to Britain, rather than having them not pay taxes and still under the radar? And also, there's a number thrown about in the campaign debates as to the percentage of people actually coming from Europe. And I hate to quote the Daily Mail, but I'm going to. It's actually 65% come from Europe. So most of our immigration can't be capped anyway. So really, we need to do something about the issue now. And I do feel, yeah, it's a bit out there, but we need out there policies. And the Lib Dems are offering an actual policy on immigration instead of just blaming someone else. So I agree with education reform. I agree with parliamentary reform. I agree with tax cuts for the poor and tax increases for the rich. I'm sure we're going to talk about tax later. But really, if you haven't got the money to pay, if you're living on a small income, then why should you be punished? And if you've got that money, you're profiting from a system. You're profiting from a country. You should have to pay back into that system. People don't need hundreds of millions of pounds. I don't need 100 millions of pounds. But there are people out there. The welfare state, I'm a child of the welfare state. I would not be here if it wasn't for Labour's welfare state. But I can't vote for Labour because they've been failing the people of this country for a long time. I can't vote for the Tories because of the history of what happened when Margaret Thatcher came into power, what happened to my family during that. And that's why this afternoon I agreed with Nick, I agree with the Liberal Democrats, and I put a cross for Mike Bell, my Liberal Democrat MP, candidate even. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. I think we've got time for a few questions, if anyone's got any questions, and that's going to be in Cambridge or in London. Okay, we'll take one at the back.
Yeah, one of the areas where Lib Dems and the Tories seem to agree on civil liberties, they both either question or oppose the wait time after arrest, national ID cards, control orders, and incredibly enough, storing DNA of people that have been arrested but never convicted. Isn't Labour especially vulnerable on this issue? Aren't they the greatest threat to civil liberties, regardless of whether the Libs or the Tories actually are allowed to form a coalition?
Okay, we'll start at this end. We'll start with Orban.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is one of the few areas that the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives do agree.
Very few.
Yes, the Tories are at risk, and I do think the majority of the British people would agree with the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives that civil liberties is something that we've always stood for in Britain and that have been a strong part of British society. And Labour are distancing themselves from the electorate by having these policies.
Okay, Josh?
I would agree with that to an extent. I wouldn't allow the Conservatives to say they are the extremely liberal party. Vote for change, vote for Conservative is a very oxymoronic to me. But if you want to check a dictionary, Conservative, yeah. Yes, I agree that the Liberal Democrats and the Tories do align themselves on these ideas of civil liberties, and it's a concern that the Labour Party has not done enough to promote that. And we've discussed the economy, we'll discuss it again, I'm sure. It's a big issue in that ID cards is a waste of money. Storing unnecessary data of prisoners, of people who are not convicted, is unnecessary. And again, I'm liberal-minded and think if it's unnecessary, then why do it? And maybe our Labour friend can tell us.
Well, I may not be as well versed on this issue, particularly because I'm more focused on climate change. But I believe that the safety of the British nation is very important, and we need to be able to collect that information, use that information to help prevent crime and prevent terrorism. And I think we are not attacking civil liberties, but we're just merely promoting the safety of the British nation.
Okay, thank you. I'll take this question at the front.
Gene Hogan is my name. I'm doing my PhD in international security, and there's been a lot of laughter in the room. But, they say votes have consequences, and so my question is on foreign policy, especially because I know that Josh will die if I ask a question on the economy, and I don't want to destroy your panel here. No matter how much I disagree with the Lib Dems. But the question on foreign policy is this for the Conservatives and also for Lib Dems. For Lib Dems, what are you offering in terms of, is this going to be a new foreign policy under Nick Clegg? And for the Conservatives, you mentioned that Britain should never again follow America into a war without providing support for its troops. Say David Cameron was in 10 Downing Street instead of Tony Blair. Can you name one or two things that would be done differently in March 2003, on the 18th of March, the day before Iraq was invaded?
Okay, we'll start with Josh.
Well, you brought up Iraq, and the Liberal Democrats were the people to oppose Iraq war in Parliament. And Nick Clegg, throughout his campaign, has said it's a war he disagrees with, and a war that he would not have followed America. Brown accused Clegg of endangering the American-British relationship and would alienate America. And I don't think that Nick Clegg in any way would be alienated from working with Barack Obama. I think they actually share many ideals. It's absurd to try and compare the Democrats to the Tories, and that's always confused me. I'm not even going to discuss that. I don't understand how that happens, but it's being made in Britain, and I think Nick Clegg would have a very good relationship with America, but also understand that if America is going to enter into wars, there needs to be a reason behind it. And I think Clegg, as I said, opposed Iraq, Afghanistan. We need to look at. He will reevaluate that. I'm assuming. I mean, I'm not talking on his behalf, of course, but he needs to reevaluate that. But we all agree with foreign policy. We need to look at supplying our troops with the supplies they need. But
Yeah, Albany.
Personally, I think probably back in 2003, if David Cameron had been Prime Minister, we probably would have supported America, and I think David Cameron has said that quite openly. Personally, I think there was a lot that Tony Blair was having his Falklands War. People have said George Bush was finishing off what his father had done. But I think David Cameron would have been a lot more careful. I think the Conservatives understand the forces much better than the Labour Party, and I think they would have diverted funds to the army much earlier. The Labour Party seemed to wait until there was a disaster, until people were dying, until Land Rovers were being blown up by explosives, and then they began to do something about it when it was all too late. I think David Cameron would have done that much earlier. With Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats being, I've heard people say he's anti-American. I think it is important to realise, and this is a personal view, that the special relationship between America and Britain is only special to Britain, or that's the way it seems, I think, to a lot of people. And so the whole issue there needs to be re-evaluated by the next government. This doesn't mean Britain needs to distance itself from America. It's an important ally for both countries, but the issue needs to be looked at closely.
Okay, and do we have any questions from London?
People do have questions.
We
they
do?
can step up to that podium there, so you're on camera. I have a question from one.
This year, 48% of GDP in the UK will be spent by the government. So roughly half of the money that I earn or you earn will be taken away from us and spent by the government, which is why we have such a massive budget deficit and why we have such a massive national debt. Do any of the three of you have any material policies that will significantly cut the amount of money that is taken away from us and spent by the government?
Okay, we'll start with Manny.
I mean, I think it is still very important to increase spending at this time when we do need to bring about economic recovery. But afterwards, we do plan by 2014 to reduce the deficit by 50%. And that means restructuring the structural deficit and reducing that by 2/3 by the next parliament. So I think that's our substantial change.
Okay, and Josh?
Again, I'm not an economist, and this will probably be a bad response, but I can, from reading around economic policy, the Liberal Democrats are the only ones who've highlighted, I believe, a quarter of the cuts they will make. David Cameron and Gordon Brown talk about cuts and talking about trying to solve the deficit, but haven't told us where those cuts are coming from. Throughout the past year, Vince Cable, I have a lot of faith in Vince Cable, and as do a lot of parliamentarians. So for sorting out the economy, I think our hands, the economy will be better in the hands of Vince Cable than Mr. Osborne. And I think it's funny that the Tories are not actually putting Osborne out there to discuss the economy, whereas Vince Cable has been going and really trying to explain and highlight the areas that the Liberal Democrats will have to make cuts in and try and solve this national and international issue that we're all facing. That's the best answer I can give.
Okay, and Albany?
I think it's important to realise that we're in an economic crisis at the moment, and it isn't easy to suddenly reduce tax and allow people to have more money. It just doesn't work like that. But I do think David Cameron is the only leader who has announced he will have an emergency budget. He will get rid of a lot of labour laws straight away, and he has some very strong policies. I believe, not that I can tell you a huge amount about them,
Sorry, continue.
about getting rid of the quangos that have been set up by Labour. And as I said, £100 billion is spent every year on the quangos, the unelected people who are working for the government. Very easily, by reducing this number considerably, we can save a lot of money and put more money back into the pockets of you and I.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. And do we have another one in London? Okay, so we'll go for one in Cambridge then. Okay, we'll go on the front row here.
I am stunned to read in the poll in the latest Economist that British voters, in public opinion polling they did, seem to be almost as concerned about the National Health Service and crime as issues that will influence their vote as they are about the economy. In each case, it seems to be 90% or more. I'd be interested in some help, and of course this stuns me because it goes against the notion, the conventional wisdom that this election will be decided on the economy. Could it be decided on crime and the National Health Service?
Okay, we'll start
for anyone.
We'll start with Albany.
I think at every election, everybody will say that the NHS and crime are important to them. It affects everybody, unlike America. The large majority of people have a national health service, and it's funded for entirely by the government. And everybody has either used it at some stage, uses it often, or has family members who are affected by it. So everybody wants to see an increase or an improvement in the NHS, and crime the same. Whether the election can be decided on it, I don't think so. I think the economy is the big issue, and the economy affects NHS, and the economy affects crime. And I think that is probably the issue that most people are thinking about before they go into the polls.
Okay, and Manny?
I think they're both very important issues, and I think the British people are clearly thinking about them, because a safer people and a healthier people affect the economy and makes a stronger economy. So I think by strengthening the National Healthcare Service and by making a safer streets and safer country, I think those are on people's minds, and that it could very well be a decision-making factor.
And Josh?
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that there are other issues. That, the economy and immigration have dominated all three televised debates and most news coverage. But I think, again, this is just from a personal standpoint, where I stand on the ideas of crime, on National Health Service. Two things that, well, National Health Service is something that Britain prides itself on. I don't know whether Albany or anyone could answer, but I know it's something that the Tories are more likely to cut when cuts have to be made. The NHS, I don't feel, just from a personal view, is safe in the Tories' hands. And again, crime is an issue that's affecting our country in a bad way, and what we need to do is start tackling the sources of crime. David Cameron is very up for putting up prison centres, whereas Nick Clegg, and this is again isn't something that everyone agrees with, and that's something I agree with, but wants to reduce prison sentences in that people are made to do community service, so we don't clog up prisons, and we start trying to deter people, because prison is not a deterrent for a majority of people. There are a lot of young people who go in and out of the prison system. If people are continually going in and out of prison, there's something going wrong. If they're not concerned about going back into prison, if it doesn't deter them from robbing a shop, doing some drugs, then there should be a way of deterring people. So we need to work on deterrence. And I think looking at more liberal ideas in deterring people, rather than just locking everyone up, is perhaps a way that the Liberal Democrats can go.
Okay, so I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much to our debaters. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'm going to be handing back to Tricia now, I think.
I just want to thank the undergraduate club of the UK for putting this together. This was terrific, and I think all our debaters did a wonderful job. While we take a minute or two to switch up panels and to set the panel up in the UK, because our next panel is our faculty experts, and one of them is joining us from the UK. What if there are people in the UK who just want to come up to the mic while we're switching over for the next minute or so, and just give us a sense of what the mood in Britain today is like, what they found when they were going to the polls. I think we'd probably be interested in hearing that here. From afar, of course, it's a very exciting election, but from up close, we'd like to hear your thoughts. So, thanks.
Maybe I can get that started. I voted this morning at about 7:15 on the way to the office, and it was, in this country, unlike the UK, it's quite an old-style process. You have a pencil, and you literally make a big X on a sheet of paper and stick it in a box. And they use that. Probably none of the panelists back in Cambridge will remember that that's how you used to vote at the fire station across from Memorial Hall. It's a little fancier now. I think you pull a switch, but one of my early votes was in Cambridge, was done the same way. At 7:30 a.m. it was quite quiet. I expected to see a very large queue. It was a quiet polling place. I think I was probably the second person in. So my early morning experience was quite different than you might have expected if you were reading the papers. So from my perspective, at 7 a.m. the turnout looked pretty light, because the turnout seemed to consist only of me. But I'd be interested to hear from other people in London who have voted later in the day and in different places. I was voting in central London in Belgravia, but others, who are in this room, obviously have been out, we hope, voting in other districts and other neighborhoods. It'd be quite interesting to see what they saw. So please come up and let the people in Cambridge know. How many people voted today? Oh, so we've got a bunch of people who can tell us what they saw at the polling place.
I'm from the Twickenham constituency, which is Vince Cable. Vince Cable is my MP, and it wasn't really a choice of party for me. I actually voted for the MP, because he's a really good MP. He's the only one that's really tried to explain the financial crisis, and he's always there and trying to be there for you. When I went to the polls at 9 o'clock, because it is his constituency, I really expected there to be a lot of people. I went about 9:30 when I thought all the people going to the city would have already voted. The only people who were voting were old people. No young mothers. No, it was basically old people.
Anybody else want to let us know what they saw?
I voted this afternoon in central London also, in a constituency that I think is 50% or more than 50% conservative. So there were lots of old people voting. The one interesting thing, about or the difference between election day in England and the election day in the U.S. is it's really boring because the media doesn't talk about anything. They basically don't talk about the election. So it's actually a bit bizarre if you're used to the typical U.S. election day.
Well, actually, I think that's a great segue to the next panel, where we're actually going to talk about the election and the meaning of the election for Britain. So I'm going to invite Peter Hall and Dick Rosecrance up to the seat, and I think we have one more. Okay, one more.
I just wanted to add that my experience was quite different in Bayswater, where I poll watched for 2 hours, and I helped a number of baby carriages come up. And there were lots of young mums. I don't know how they voted, but and there was plenty of interest in the electorate there. So that may be a difference of location, and we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Would you, if you'd rather do that? I think so. I can, makes it easier to walk those, and then I'll come over here. Yes. Okay.
And we have Jim Alt on the screen up there. So let me welcome you to this part of the panel. And I just want to say something very briefly before Don and I introduce our panelists about the genesis of this event. When he and I, and Don is, those of you who came in late may not know, Don is the head of the club in the UK, the Harvard Alumni Club in the UK. When we first talked about this event in early February, we were very excited about the idea of doing a joint event between London and Cambridge, between the Harvard Club of the UK and CES. Co-hosting the first transatlantic elections party, and not just a party, but also with faculty insight, struck us as a model for future collaboration between what's going on campus and elsewhere in the world. Harvard is truly committed, as many of you know, to being a global university and being able to connect with the Harvard community internationally, especially our alumni, is something that I'm particularly interested in figuring out how to do well and innovatively, and Don has been a great supporter in that. At that point, though, the election itself did not seem to hold that many surprises. In the polls at the time, such as the Guardian's poll, the Tories were holding steady at 40%, Labour was in the high 20s, and the Liberals were polling around 19, 20, 21%. It seemed like we were looking at an election that was going to be a change, but it was, the expected outcome was that the Tories would come back to power after 13 years. Labour seemed rather resigned to the inevitable, and in fact, sort of as an aside, I spent much of the winter fielding calls from British civil servants and members of the government who wanted to take some time off and think, and thought that CS might be a good place for that. And so I sort of thought we were going to be the government in exile for Labour for a while. And the Lib Dem support was more or less holding steady at where they had been since the early part of the 2000s. Well, a lot can happen in 3 months. And now we have not just an exciting event here, but also a very exciting election, as I think the students so well pointed out. It's an election that has seen an unprecedented number of candidates who have not run for re-election. This is in the wake of the parliamentary expenses scandals. The rise of the Liberal Democrats, particularly Nick Clegg after the American-style debates. And we also, I think, need to put that into context of the decline of the proportion of the vote that the two major parties are getting, from 90% 40 years ago to only 68% 5 years ago. That they control an outsized number of seats, though, as was pointed out in the debates earlier, is one of the issues pushing for electoral reform, as has been a big issue in this campaign. And of course the recession, and more recently the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, has made not only the economy but the need for deep cuts, probably tax increases, a major part of the election. And as Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, recently said, whoever wins this election is going to have to make such deep and painful cuts that they will probably be out of power after that for a full generation. So this has been a much more interesting and exciting election than we might have thought when we planned this. And of course, the polls in the UK don't close until 10 p.m. Greenwich time, which means that we don't have results. But what we do have is some of the best minds in the business here and in London to give us some insights into what this election means, what the election means for Britain, what the election means for Europe, and what the election means, importantly, for transatlantic relationships. So I'm going to turn it over to Don Guiney in the UK. He's going to introduce our first panelist. And as many of you know, Don is the president of the Harvard Club of the UK. He is a classics graduate from the college. He's a partner at Freshfields Brookhouse Deringer in London, which is in fact where they are meeting right now, which is the room that we're seeing there. And he's also the father of Noah, class of 2013. So let me turn it over to Don.
Thank you, Tricia. I will be brief. Standing next to me is Jim Alt, who is a professor in the government department. He's the Thomson Professor of Government. He very kindly sent over a resume and a CV that, frankly, we don't all have enough time to go through. The number of publications in US and UK political journals and political science journals does not fit onto one page. What struck me most about Jim's resume and his experience is how British focused it is. I was joking with him beforehand that, based certainly on the resume and his experience, particularly with surveys of British electoral politics, I suspect that Jim has forgotten more about British politics and British elections than many British electoral commentators will ever know. So we're very, very honored that Jim has made the trip down from Oxford, put on his finest lecturing clothes, and we very, very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. And we hope this is more than simply a learned talking heads session. We really hope that there's some give and take among the panelists, and would urge people in Cambridge and here in London, after the speakers have given their observations, to step up to the podium and pose questions to them. And finally, I would like to say to the undergraduates, while we call this an expert panel, they are going to have to definitely deliver their A game if they're going to hold a candle to the undergraduates. They did a terrific job. Very well done.
Hi. I assume you can, if not see me, hear me. Let me know if you can't. Hello, Trish. Hello, Richard. Hello, Peter. Good to see you all.
Hey there.
How wonderful it is to be here for an election for the first time, actually since October 1974, because on the day Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979, my wife, I, and 2 children fled the country for the United States. And I have actually not been in Britain for an election since then. It's really interesting being back. I've had an enormously good time. One does, exactly as Ray Dutch said a minute ago, have to remember that this is a British election, which means that the day itself is very quiet. You can go round to the polling station. There are no placards. There are no activists. There is no hoopla. There is nothing except a modest handwritten sign on the Wesleyan Chapel that says polling station. And yet it's here that a Lib Dem marginal seat is being fought for by the 20 or 30 people in line outside, and those who join them and those who come out. So it is quiet and it's odd, and therefore we have to first and foremost remember that even if it is true that what is special and consequential about this election for Britain is that it is an exciting election, this is Britain, and the Brits would never let that show. So, having made the basics of the situation clear, let me say that, let me first say, boy, is it fun being given the job of talking about the meaning of an election, for a country without knowing what the results of the election are. But you all know that doesn't even slow us down, let alone stop us. So we'll speculate away. I think this election is very special. It's been fun being here. I think it will be consequential. What I hope I can say that will provoke conversation, if not provoke anger, is that I think the ways in which it will be consequential are not the ways that people are talking about, and that's essentially going to be the bulk of my talk. But let me start by the easy things, the things we can say about the election without having any idea at all what the election results would be. Pausing on my way to that for a product disclaimer, I have talked over the last 24 hours to every insider I can find here, and I have no private information to share with you. Every bit of advice that I get from people is that there's no reason to think that the polls aren't roughly a good guide to the outcome. The only reason not to think that is that for the last 30 years, the polls have never been a good guide to the outcome. But that doesn't help us because we don't know at all about how they're not going to be. So we'll assume roughly that that will be the outcome. What can we say without knowing the outcome is true of this election? I think we can say it's been really interesting and somewhat exciting, and it has reminded the people of Britain after a couple of sort of duds that elections really can be consequential and are interesting, and you want to think a little bit about what you're doing before you do it, and that there is just a lot to think about, see, and say. If that is true, this being Britain, you won't know it because people are having excited conversations in the CAFs, but you will know it because turnout will go up, and that will be entirely a good thing. And if I had to make a forecast about this election, it would be that turnout will be up on the last couple. Maybe not by a ton, maybe more in marginal seats than in kind of one-sided seats, but I think it will be up, and I think that will be good, and I think that will kind of make people feel a little better about the health of the polity here. And so that is something that I'm willing to forecast without any knowledge, and at least hope comes true. What else can we say without knowing much about the outcome? Actually, I think one thing we can say, markets are roiled by uncertainty, but I don't think they need to be. I actually don't think the economy is much of an issue in this election. Everybody knows fiscal policy has got to be fixed. People don't know it, but it is true, and they will come to know it, that the Germans are way out ahead of Britain in this score, but Britain's got to go something like the same route and begin to move towards balancing the budget. There are, yes, differences between the parties. The Conservatives want to do a little more, a little sooner, and the Lib Dems want to make the tax side a little more progressive. But every instinct I have says all those things are issues of money and issues of time, and if there are two things that are divisible and can therefore be compromised if necessary to make them happen, it is money and time. And so my sense is, insofar as it's possible to fix fiscal policy, it'll be fixed no matter what the election outcome is, in ways that are probably pretty similar. Ditto immigration, in spite of those excellent presentations by the debaters. Party differences on immigration are not large. Everybody is standing up for some kind of tightening. The liberals have a slightly, Lib Dems have a slightly distinctive policy about what to do with immigrants who are already here. But again, this is the small change of politics, and it's not going to bring us gridlock and stasis and collapse. It was interesting to hear health and crime raised. The interesting thing about health and crime are that they are the two areas in which it is unambiguous that things have gotten better in the last 5 years. Health outcomes look better. Crime rates are down. Yeah, you can't quite say that for violent crime as opposed to all crime. But again, it's pretty much unambiguously true that these would be areas in which the Labor government could claim success if it were in any position to convince people that it had been successful, which I think it isn't. But that's why on the domestic policy side, and that makes a real difference to how I present this talk, because my colleagues in Cambridge have reserved the transatlantic alliance and Europe for their topics, and so I'm going to leave that to them. But it may well be that those are actually the areas in which party differences as we go into the election might be more consequential. And my sense is that there is just not a lot of stake domestically, at least not over the short term. So we can't go any further without saying something about the election result, and that's really my text. So what I want to do is tell you how to listen to the returns tonight. Basically, the Conservatives have been mired in the polls at about 37%. And at about 37%, no matter how you slice it, no matter how the Lib Dems and Labor carve up the votes they get, Conservatives are not going to get a full majority. They just don't. You can play with the numbers all you want, but Conservative seats kind of peak at about 305, and that's 20 short, so they don't even really do it with help from Ulster. They could buy off every region other than England with promises of ducking the spending cuts, but that would really be a form of shooting themselves in the foot that would probably not be worth it. You know, being elected in order to take out the pain on your supporters is just not the way you want to do it if you're confronting the possibility of having another election soon, which they probably would be. So my sort of forecast is, yes, indeed, Cameron for next prime minister, but probably not with a majority, but with a substantial minority government in the area of, I don't know, 290 seats, something like that. And this holds true. Now, this is the interesting thing to play with in the electoral system. Kind of no matter how the Lib Dems and Labor carve up the 54 or so percent that they're forecast to get between them, obviously, if each party expands its share of that, they do better. But because if they do better, the other party is doing worse, that kind of rewards the Conservatives against the other party on one margin while taking away their support on another margin, and it doesn't really affect the overall numbers, just the distribution of seats among the other two parties. So what I want to get you focused on thinking about, because I think it's where this election will be really, really consequential in Britain, is that it is going to draw unambiguous attention to the bias in the British electoral system. Now, we've all heard about the bias in the electoral system. We're probably tired of hearing about it because we know that we've read the articles that say, yeah, Labor would do better than the Conservatives. It's not really fair. That actually misses the point entirely. Let me try to do a very, I hate to do this, but let me try to do a very simple numerical example and see if we can focus on what the problem is in the British electoral system. Right now, the polls are saying that the Conservatives are going to get about 37% of the vote and the Lib Dems are going to get about 27, and Labor is going to get about 27, okay? And everybody else is going to get about 9. So do me a favor for 1 minute, and let's just stipulate that that's the outcome, okay? There's lots we could say about whether it really will be or not and what's going on. But let's just hang on to those numbers, and let's forget the others, and just go with the 37, 27, 27. If you go to the BBC and use their sort of derived swingometer and you put those numbers into it, the Conservatives get 301 votes. Did any of you bother to run the counterfactual in which Labor gets the 37%? Don't say to me, but they're not going to. I know they're not going to. But did you stop for a second and think, what if Labor got 37 and the Tories and Lib Dems each got 27? How many seats would Labor get? Did I hear 371? That would be the answer. And now, ask yourself, I know it's a counterfactual, but you can do it. Ask yourself, what if the Lib Dems got the 37% and Labor and the Tories each got 27? How many seats would the Lib Dems get, making all the usual uniform swing assumptions? How many seats would the Lib Dems get? Come on, gang, you should all have thought about this because it's the headline story of this election. 205.
That's right.
166 seats less than Labor gets on an identical vote. That is, without a doubt, one of the most biased electoral systems in the world. So why am I telling you all this? Because I think if the Lib Dems do well, we might see a tectonic shift in British politics, but not the one everybody talks about. Not proportional representation. That's not their friend. That's a center-left coalition forever. How boring. What if you could reform the existing electoral system to eliminate the pro-labor bias and produce a fair electoral system? Why, the Lib Dems could move into being immediately the number 2 party and maybe be one election away from being the number 1 party on their own. So I think what we might see, if they feel good about how they do, is that that outcome that everybody is expecting, that PR is going to be the basis of inter-party bargaining, might not happen at all. You might just see a handshake between Nick Clegg taking whatever he can get to get into government so the Lib Dems can prove that they really are a party that can govern, take something and do well at it, would be kindly old Uncle Jim's advice to him. And they'll agree on a quick reform of the electoral system to produce a fair outcome before the next election, which will inevitably be held somewhere between 18 months and 3 years down the road. Anyway, that's a speculative and provocative thought to leave you with. Yes, I know, there are obstacles. We would have to pack the Lords to do that probably, and a bunch of other things. But you know, to an American thinking about redistricting, all those other things are really doable, and I think they'll get done. Anyway, that's my say-so from London. It's great to see you both, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, now we are going to turn our attentions to the meaning of this election for Europe. Peter Hall is going to give us his thoughts on that. Peter is the Krupp Professor of European Studies. He is a professor in the government department, and he is the former director of this center. He is also, like Jim, has a CV that we don't have time to read all of, but I will highlight his recent Successful Societies, How Institutions and Culture Affect Health, which he is co-author with Michel Lamont on, and it is a wonderful read. Let me turn over the podium to Peter to talk about the meaning for Europe.
Tricia, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, one of the key rules for all Harvard faculty is you should never really try to keep up with the undergraduates. So I just want to let Dawn know that we won't be trying too hard to do that. And it's a special pleasure to talk in a context where we have a distinguished audience in London as well. And I don't simply mean my distinguished friend and colleague, Jim Alt. This is really innovative, and I want to point out that it's Tricia who does this, and if she were given her way all the time, well, we would live in an entirely electronic world, and we might or might not be better for doing that. Well, as Jim said, the members of this panel are in a slightly unenviable position. We're being asked to discuss the meaning of an election whose results are still less than fully evident. And as that famous American sage, Yogi Berra, once said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And my charge is to make some remarks about the meaning of this election for Europe. And after thinking about it for quite some time, I might say, I think that this task is manageable because, with one exception that I'll mention in a moment, I think this election has virtually no meaning for Europe. And that is a notable fact, and something of an unhappy commentary, I think, both on British politics and on the European Union. And so I want to say a few words about why I take that view. It's possible, of course, as we all know, and in some sense we heard from the undergraduate debaters, it's possible to discern differences between the parties on the European Union in particular. And the most striking differences, of course, are between the two parties that are most likely to form the new government, namely the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And these differences are apparent in the party manifestos. I like the fact that you can still see something in British party manifestos as opposed to most others. If I had to choose a sentence from each of them to characterize the party's position, I'd choose these sentences. So from the Conservative manifesto, I would take the phrase, the steady and unaccountable intrusion of the European Union into almost every aspect of our lives has gone too far. By contrast, the Liberal Democratic manifesto says, we must lead in Europe, not snipe from the sidelines. And of course, these differences are also reflected in the leaders of the two parties. As everyone around the world knows by now, Nick Clegg has a Dutch mother, a half-Russian father, and his three children are called Antonio, Alberto, and Miguel. He was for some years an official of the European Commission and a member of the European Parliament. David Cameron, of course, is a direct descendant of King William IV, and his children are named Ivan, Nancy, and Arthur. Now, as contemporary Conservatives go, David Cameron is relatively moderate on Europe, but he's far from what we might think of as pro-European. He took the British Conservative Party, as you know, out of the mainstream People's Party grouping in the European Parliament. And the Conservative manifesto proposes several things that are notable. A UK sovereignty bill to limit the reach of the European Court of Justice. It indicates that Britain will no longer hand further powers to the EU without a referendum, which could in the long run be consequential. Seeks explicit opt-outs from the Charter of Rights. Britain has a formal opt-out from that, but it doesn't always work. And the manifesto opposes any use of the ratchet clauses built into the Lisbon Accords. These are what Europeans call the passerelle, which could increase the reach of qualified majority voting inside the EU somewhat under the radar screen. So these are not inconsequential differences. But Nick Clegg is unlikely to become the next British Prime Minister. I think even Jim would think I'm safe in saying that. And at best, he may be a moderating force in a conservative Lib Dem coalition. Now, of course, we would get something different, very different, from a Labour Lib Dem coalition under a new leader, such as maybe David Miliband or Ellen Johnson. This seems clearly very unlikely at the moment, but not entirely impossible. So this would be a government relatively sympathetic to Europe and the European Union. The sentence that sums up the Labour manifesto reads, our belief is that Europe is stronger in the world when the EU is strong. But very real though the differences in leaders and in manifestos are, whether any of the policies of the next British government, any government feasible at this hour. Whether those policies would actually differ from the others is not at all clear. Because the core fact is that the British electorate is lukewarm on the European Union, and successive British governments have forged a relatively consistent stance on it. They don't want to join the euro. They want to continue to belong to the European Union, but they see the European Union first and foremost as a large free trade zone, and second, through the accession states, as a bulwark for democracy in Eastern Europe. Everything else is pretty much an embellishment, a nuisance, or a threat. So over the short or medium term, I think it's hard to see this stance changing under any feasible British government. Now, in the past, this British stance, has been important for Europe. In the decades since 1979, Britain has gotten, in my view, largely what it wanted from the European Union. With the Single Europe Act and the addition of members to the East and South, the EU has become much more like a large free trade zone than a European federation, as some, including maybe even Jacques Delors, might have hoped. And the European Commission itself has been redefined, in some sense, as an agent for the liberalization of markets across its member states. And for different reasons, I think this outcome suited both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. But the neoliberal era is in crisis, if not entirely over, and the challenges facing Europe, and here I think particularly of the European Union, are different today. They're most palpable, of course, in the Eurozone, whose members are finding that fiscal rules, a small set of rules of the sort embedded in the Stability and Growth Pact, are not enough to ensure the fiscal coordination that makes monetary union possible. Institutional development is on the agenda. None of the member states want it, I might add, but in some sense it's forced onto the agenda by the current economic crisis in the Eurozone, and in some respects it's urgent. And within the European Union as a whole, there are corresponding issues about how to regulate the financial sector that are also of some importance and highly transnational. So once again, on this side of the agenda too, building transnational institutional capacities is something that it's difficult for the EU to avoid considering. But by virtue of its stance, I think Britain finds itself on the sidelines in such matters. It's not a member of the Eurozone, which is, it must be said, a huge economic advantage. Bravo for successive British governments. But it's a political disadvantage when it comes to clout inside the European Union. Britain's not enthusiastic about transnational regulations with power over transnational institutions with power over financial regulations. And it's unsympathetic to more radical proposals to give the EU more scope to stimulate economic development, let alone the resources to redistribute in any substantial way inside the EU. And in my view, this is a slightly unhappy state of affairs for the European Union as well, because I doubt that the neoliberal policies of the past will be enough to cope with the economic challenges of the present. And here's the one exception that I might make to this argument, which suggests that the outcome of this election is not so crucial for the EU. The European Parliament is currently considering legislation that would create 3 new EU agencies to coordinate the oversight of banks, insurers, and security markets. Now, the direct regulatory powers of these agencies are likely to be limited, but these agencies could have quite significant coordinating capabilities. And at a summit last June in which the legislation on which this was based was considered by the member states all supported it, including the UK. So the question here is whether the UK will continue to support these steps as this legislation makes its way to the European Council. For the most part, I expect the UK will, but the election could make a difference. A majority conservative government, which is still a possibility, although I take Jim's cautionary notes on that very seriously, a majority Conservative government, which is after all already planning to dismantle the Financial Services Agency, might be less friendly to this regulation, this legislation on European financial regulation, than a coalition government in which the Liberal Democrats have a prominent role. I would think that while David Cameron probably is not looking forward to a coalition with Nick Clegg, he might have ultimate reason to be grateful for Nick Clegg when it comes to EU issues, since there's a perfect excuse there to pursue more moderate policies than some of the Conservatives would support. So the front of financial regulation seems to me to be the one to watch in the coming months if we're to see what the impacts of this election on Britain's stance in Europe are to be. The real issue will be financial regulation, and here, of course, Britain has strong interests. I mean, to some extent, international relations, I think, are determined by national interests rather than the positions of parties, and Britain has a clear national interest. The City of London means, the importance of the City of London for the British economy means that Britain must be cautious about financial regulation. But whether Britain can afford to stay on the sidelines of the debate about how to coordinate the economies of Europe more broadly is not so clear. And whether Europe can afford to have Britain on the sidelines is not so clear either. At the moment, I think those issues are currently dominated by the opposing positions of Germany and France. France would like to see more assertive coordination. It would like to see more EU institutions with more capacities to direct and in some sense support the economic policies of the member states. Something like a political authority that would act as a counterpart to the European Central Bank. Germany is currently, as we know, strongly opposed to that. The Germans still believe in rules, and they certainly believe in saving. Well, the EU then faces stalemate on this issue. Normally, we could expect Britain, I think, to break that stalemate in one direction or another. And the big question is whether any government elected later tonight or early tomorrow morning or Friday, as some of the more pessimistic commentators suggest, whether any British government will really be able to weigh in on this debate, given that Britain is to some extent on the sidelines of it. Let me finish with a word about the long term, and by the long term I mean about 10 to 15 years from now. I firmly believe that over that period, Britain's own prosperity will depend on the prosperity of Europe and the effectiveness of the European Union. I mean, that may not be welcome news. I'm not a religious believer in Europe. I think it's a simple fact of the global economy. And without the active engagement of British governments, it's going to be very difficult to secure an effective European Union. Well, will British government become more active in the coming years? If the immediate outcome is a Conservative government or even a Conservative Lib Dem coalition, I don't see much changing in the foreseeable future. But suppose, just for a moment, with an unparalleled act of imagination, suppose that the ultimate outcome is a Labour-Liberal Democratic coalition. Maybe after a Conservative Liberal Democratic coalition fails or fails to materialize. Well, this would put the Conservatives into opposition. And in this case, a Labour-Liberal Democratic government might indeed, over time, I think it'll take some time, decide that it needs to engage more deeply, even more deeply with Europe. Well, that could be a good thing, but that might also, I think very likely, would provoke a reaction inside the Conservative Party, where hostility to Europe could become, again, a dominant force within that party. And in that case, the European Union might emerge as a dominant issue in the next election. It's been no issue in this election. And Britain then might face a stark choice in that next election, and one with even greater consequences for Europe. But before we talk about the next election, maybe we should see the results of this one. A week is a long time in politics. It's still a long time in politics, and I suspect we have some interesting weeks ahead of us.
And our final speaker on our panel before we turn it over to questions is Richard Rosecrance. Dick is Professor of Public Policy as well as Senior Fellow in the Belfer Center, both at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard. He has written extensively on all kinds of international issues, many of the issues that that are of great concern to all of us, international trade, globalization, terrorism. He has also served on the Policy Planning Council at the State Department and has spent many sabbaticals and time in the UK, including at King's College, the London School of Economics, and Nuffield College at Oxford. Richard is going to talk about the meaning of this election for the transatlantic relationship. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tricia, and all the other speakers. I think this election is going to be a hung parliament. I mean, I think the kind of data, or at least the suggested trends that Jim Alt identified, push in that direction. If you look at the latest BBC poll, it's something like Conservative 297 seats, Labor around 252, the Liberal Democrats 75, and others 26. If that were to be the case, and of course these things can go wildly wrong, it would turn out that even with the other 26, the northern parties, assuming that Mr. Cameron would soldier on with such a narrow edge, would still not get him to the 326 that he needs. He would still be 29 short. So unless he's going to go it alone and run a minority government, which would be very risky, he has to turn probably to the Liberal Democrats. And what will that mean in practical terms, you know, both for the stability of the parliament that then exists and its effect upon foreign policy, particularly in regard to transatlantic relationships? Well, it would mean, I think, as Jim Alt, I think, quite presciently foresaw, another election within a fairly short period of time. Edward Heath couldn't hang in there in 1973 and had to go for an election when he ended up short of the needed majority. And the same would be true, I think, of the Conservatives, even though they might be assisted or would be assisted by the Liberal Democrats this time around. So you have something like 6 months or 3 months. Nothing crucial is going to be decided. So all those issues that come up for grabs that are foreign policy issues, such as the British deterrent, should they replace the Trident, and if so, with what? Should there be some repatriation of the social clauses of the European Union Treaty? All relations with the United States, all those important questions would, I think, be up in the air. I don't think, although this may be an early judgment, that if some coalition government forms, the Conservatives will agree to change in proportional representation, no matter how strongly Nick Clegg insists upon it. Certainly in the short term, I think it's very unlikely for there to be a change along those lines. And I should add that redistricting the House of Commons along the lines suggested by Jim Alt, although wholly desirable, would require a huge change in British politics. Think of all those lords that are already uneasy in their seats, Jim, after your suggestion that they would be overborne by another 100 or so nominated in order to get redistricting through. I think that is extremely unlikely to occur. I'm not saying it's undesirable. I think it is desirable, but I think it's very unlikely to occur. It's not clear what the effect would be of such a coalition government on taxes and spending. People might say, gee, we don't know what's going to happen in the next election. Why don't we delay at least the tax portion until after that election without having to face the necessity of doing something right now. Nick Clegg would probably push for some degree of rapprochement with Europe, but would that be a short-term move, or could it only take place over the longer term? Probably only in the longer term. Now, the European issue, as Peter has said, is just one that is not regarded all that seriously, I think, by the British public. There seem to be some millions of Britons that aren't even aware that Britain is a member of the European Union. And those people also think that perhaps the United States is a member of the European Union. So the degree of information about what's going on in Brussels and other places is limited, to say the very least. What does this suggest for the longer term in terms of Britain's relationship with both Europe on the one hand or the United States on the other, or both taken together? And these things, of course, are not going to be established right away. They might need to be established after an election down the pike a ways. It seems it could be another nail in the European coffin. And that, of course, would affect the relationship with the United States as well. If one looks at what's going on in Europe now, it's back to the good old days again with George Canning, each nation for itself and God for us all. It doesn't suggest any coming together of the European personality to solve problems. Those various things that everyone thought would happen as a result of a challenge to European success or to the euro, such as giving new powers to Brussels in order to cope with those things haven't happened. The British election of today probably will indicate a further disenchantment with Britain, with Europe. And the election at North Rhine-Westphalia on Sunday is not going to be a resounding endorsement of German policy and assistance to Greece. So we're beginning to see a gradual unraveling. I think Peter Hall's comment that what we've got now is simply a customs union, not really an integrated body, is correct. And that raises even more questions, because there will not only be the Greek crisis to solve, which up to now has not been solved. We will have the Spanish crisis, perhaps an Irish crisis, and the pigs will go running through the streets. Now, if this is true, then I think we have a whole question about the British role in world affairs, which this election is not going to solve, even though it may raise questions in regard to it. In the 1950s, as I'm sure everybody knows, Dean Acheson said, Britain has lost an empire, but not yet found a role. This is still true today. At one time, and when I did a very lamented book on British defense in the late 60s, the issue was equally appropriate. At one time, I think Britain wanted to be the bridge, the military bridge, in part the political bridge between Europe and the United States. It would station troops on the Rhine. It would commit itself to remaining there in perpetuity, and would always be there to guarantee an American response should there be some attack on what was then called the Central Front. I think that role is no longer necessary. It's not a role that Britain particularly wants to play, but I think it means if it doesn't play that role, one is into a position of saying, well, then what role is Britain playing? Is it indeed playing any role at all? Is it, for example, just a Holland or a Sweden, a nice, big country with lots of welfare, intelligent people who more or less tend to their own affairs and don't pay much attention to what's going on elsewhere. Now, of course, that's a little unfair because Holland spends a great deal of time worrying about the financial system of the world. Britain would obviously do that as well. I don't think it means that the financial role of the City of London would be changed in any important way. But if Britain is downgraded in its role, what special argument can it make for the importance of its foreign policy? And if it can't make that role, why cling to the veto in the Security Council? Is there anything special that gives Britain the right to have that role when so many other countries like Germany and China, China does of course have it, India and so on, do not have those roles? So I think one of the most interesting questions is whether or not this is a negative election in which Britain will, as a result, at least in the short term, be downgraded by its previously close allies, downgraded by Europe because it's not really interested in Europe and will not take a large role there, downgraded by the United States because it doesn't play a role that helps the United States in its relations with Europe. And if so, then I think we may be into a situation where British decline diplomatically is going further and faster than up to this point we have believed. Thank you.
We have time for questions both here in Cambridge and in the UK. So we'll start with a question here and then we'll move to the UK. Yes, in the back. And please identify yourself.
Nick O'Donovan, I'm a lecturer in social studies. Just wondering what the panelists think the implications of this election will be for the Labour Party, what the fallout will be, what's next for the Labour Party.
Did you hear that in London, the question?
Yeah, I understood it to be what does the future hold for the Labour Party? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, we're political scientists, not seers, but my gut feeling is nothing very good. I think there will be a difficult leadership contest. There will be some division. There will be a lot of arguing over whether and more likely how far Labour should sort of retrench on New Labour and look a little more like old Labour. My gut feeling is these guys are professional politicians. They'll get through this, but there is a serious chance that they will marginalize themselves for, an election cycle or two as a result of this election. But that's the downside. I don't really believe that will happen. Peter, you probably think differently.
Yes, Jim, I think the exact opposite. I think this is
That's why I said that.
I think this is an excellent election to lose. And Labour certainly looks like it's going to lose it. It's an excellent election to lose, of course, because whatever government comes in is going to have to make very big cuts in public spending in a context where the British infrastructure is, better than it used to be, is in many respects far from substantial. And so I think people are going to feel these cuts in a variety of ways. And I think that, I don't think that's automatically going to produce disaffection with the incoming government. Jim's quite right. There's something that we'll have to see. But I think it gives Labour an opportunity. And I think I think Gordon Brown will clearly go, assuming Labour doesn't form the next government, and there will be generational renewal. I mean, while I think this election is in some ways not very exciting for Europe, I think it is very exciting for Britain because it reflects generational renewal. I think both Nick Clegg and David Cameron are 43 years old, if I'm not mistaken. That's from where I sit, that looks like generational renewal, and that's much to be desired. And I would have thought that Labour, in response to that, would do something similar, whether it be with one of the two Miliband's or one of the other contenders. I think that this is a context in which they're unlikely to move to the left, and therefore, if given that we're talking about the party that's most likely to quote-unquote lose this election, I think they'll probably be in good shape.
I'd just like to add a point that is very similar, actually, to what Peter just said. I think it will mean probably David Miliband or his brother, taking over the Labour Party, and that could be a very, very useful renewal, bringing a whole series of new leaders into that party. I think it may not, however, do much for the argument that I was trying to sketch out in terms of sort of shifting the balance of reliance on the United States on the one hand, or a greater and closer link with Europe on the other. I think Britain could still remain in abeyance in terms of its attitude on those questions, even with a degree of renewal of the people who are leading it.
Don, do we have a question from the UK?
Question from London. Stunned silence from London, possibly.
All right, well, we'll take a question from here. Sorry.
Could I ask Professor Alf something?
Are you following up on the
Sure.
same question? Or?
Well, it was really about why Labour looks like losing, and should Gordon Brown, in Professor Alf's view, should he have called the election at that moment when it looked as though he could actually win it? So,
Jim, did you get that question?
Not quite. It was something to do with the timing of the election, but
Should Gordon Brown have
maybe
called?
Tricia.
In 2007, perhaps.
Yeah.
Oh, should he?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, well. Well, of course, with hindsight, which never fails to be 20/20, given that this turned out not to be a better time, of course he should have. But it didn't look that auspicious then, and he had his hopes of more of an economic recovery now. I mean, I think the stakes in Britain look very much the way they look in the U.S., where I'm sure the incumbent Democrats are praying for a bit of a reduction in unemployment and a bit of a pickup in employment before November. I think Brown had hopes when he didn't call the election back right when he took over that by now things would look a little better than they did, and he would reap the benefit of it. And in fact, they just don't look quite good enough. He's not someone who, in my view, takes that kind of decision easily. So I don't think an election back then was ever in the cards. But like Callahan in September '78, who could have spared himself the winter of discontent, hindsight's always wonderful.
Yes.
I completely agree about how exciting the election's been, but it seems to me, and I wonder if this is unfair, that in some way it's been very conservative as well, that all the parties seem very close to each other on policy, and that they have not changed their policies much in the past year in the wake of the expenses scandal, and that kind of, opened an opportunity to introduce some radical new, policy shifts, regarding constitutionality or something else, and that there seemed to be a lot of talk about this being a new media election, and it was kind of old media election, and so while it was this very exciting election, it seems very conservative in a way in both this presentation and in the parties seem in some ways close to their past or close to one another in some ways as well.
Thank you.
That's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting perspective. I think we might have understated the differences between the parties. I mean, we'll see in part when the next government starts to do something. But I think that the Conservatives are likely to make bigger cuts in spending faster than Labour would have done, and that the location of those cuts will be different. There'll be less concern for those at the very bottom of the social pyramid, rightly or wrongly. I think on immigration, the Liberal Democratic proposal to grant an amnesty to existing illegal immigrants is actually quite a big deal. It would surprise me if it survived coalition negotiations, but I think the parties, Jim has a very nice long-term view on this, and I'd like to hear what he has to say, but there's a way in which, in most elections, British parties gravitate towards each other. That's the nature of the electoral system in which they're struggling for the median voter. And I see this election as, in some sense, no exception to that. The exceptional elections were, to some extent, Margaret Thatcher in 1979, certainly Labour in 1944, and I'm trying to think of other possible exceptions. So,
well, Labour veered pretty far to the left in '83. So
yeah, I forgot they did so badly. Yes.
Yeah, well, so let me pick up your invitation. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about this election is that there are clearly differences between the parties. I don't disagree with what you just said at all. If you actually look at sort of whatever you want to call it, the average beliefs of the average activist or member of parliament of the different parties, the differences are quite striking. The manifestos, in my view, run inside the parties, and the leaders are running way inside the manifestos. So there's much more sort of convergence in the group of three, which I think was not caused by, but brought out very clearly by the debates, which focused a lot of attention on them, did not really focus a lot of attention on significant differences. There were an awful lot of times they said, well, of course we do something like that too, but, you know, a little different, and here's where our difference is. But my strong feeling about those things is that the election campaign has been very centrist in a world in which the parties, and you would have loved to have been here this morning, Peter, the media are absolutely back to our days here. I mean, the Mirror had a full-page, front-page photo of a drunken teenage David Cameron in full regalia. The Sun, Day of Hope in block capitals. Note, not glory, just hope. You know, I mean, it really felt like the good old days. Only the Guardian threw in the towel compared to sort of what I remember. So, you know, there is this, I think the party differences are alive and well here, but I think increasingly perhaps the debate-centric, media-centric focus of campaigning brings out the commonalities among the leaders rather than the differences, and that's what we're seeing.
We have time for two more questions. We'll take one from the UK if there is one, or two from here if they're not.
You got one. I have one question. I'd like to focus back on Jim's earlier comments about the potential tectonic shift in UK politics around redistricting to achieve a fairer outcome, or an outcome that's more reflective of a national vote. I'd like to ask all the panelists if any of them think that this is even a remotely plausible outcome. And if so, how do you think we actually get there? I think everybody would agree it's a desirable outcome, but is there a plausible roadmap that gets us to that outcome in your view?
Well, I can start on that. Is it remote? Is it desirable? Yeah, an unbiased electoral system's an easy thing to support. Is it remotely plausible? Yeah, I mean, the question depends on how much weight you want to put on the remotely and the plausible part. About equally weighted? Yes, Don, it's remotely plausible. Is it easy to get to? No, it isn't. It would take determined leaders, but you know, I've been talking about this for the last couple of days, and on our way over here tonight, Bob Erickson, who is sitting in the back beaming at me, and I found ourselves sitting in a pub next to some guy who had been a Lib Dem candidate and an activist, and he went on at length about how certain he was that this is exactly what Clegg would want, and that he would jettison PR, and he should want it because he had a real shot at being one of the two major parties if he took this path instead of the safe path, which he would not get in coalition negotiations, of going after PR. So what can I say? You know, sometime soon there will be a book called The Strange Rebirth of Liberal England, and it's just that from the flack I'm taking for this idea, it'll probably be written by Rodney Dangerfield rather than George Dangerfield, but it'll appear anyway. That's my 2 cents from London.
Let me just add one point on that. I'm agreeing with the difficulty of the proposal, as I've already suggested. We need David Lloyd George in 1909 able to sort of pack his way to get his budget through. And I don't see any leaders on either side of the fence or in the middle in the British Parliament that are quite of that stature or are thrust up to such an action by virtue of events. In 1909, something had to be done. The British had to have a new tax system. Otherwise, they were in enormous difficulty. Today, I don't think there's anything that's going to force constitutional change, or at least change of this kind, which is almost constitutional, to bring about a redistricting, however desirable it might be.
Whenever three political scientists are gathered together, you get at least 4 different opinions, as often said of economists. I think this is likely to be the most consequential outcome of this election. I think Jim's right, although we can't tell, our crystal balls are cloudy, but I think that a conservative liberal democratic coalition is the most likely outcome, at least as we'll know more in a few hours. I think the Liberal Democrats will ask for a referendum on proportional representation, and the Conservatives will agree at least to the referendum. The big problem is that in general, proportional representation would likely predict over the long term, as I think Jim may have said, liberal success rather than conservative liberal success. This is the dilemma for the Conservative Party in providing proportional representation, which can come in a variety of forms, of course, and therefore there's a lot of that's unknown, even if we were to think this were likely. The Conservatives could be writing their own political obituary. That will certainly give them some pause.
Yes.
One of my friends suggested, not I think totally outrageously, that the solution to that would be to have simultaneously a coalition, or sorry, not a coalition, a referendum on independence for Scotland. Because if Scotland became independent, there are a lot of Labour voters who would secure independence, and then the long-term prospects for the Conservative Party in the remaining part of the UK under PR would look much better. So we're in for a few interesting weeks to come.
Yeah, that's a very good thing to raise, because the thought of jettisoning Scotland to become sort of maybe South Norway, to stop it from being too small to be an independent country, since after all, the examples that you use when you're defending Scotland's independent economy is, if Ireland and Iceland can do it, so can we. And those comps have lost their luster, as we like to say. The problem with the scenario, and I really probably should have said this as part of the main theme, is that the SNP are not running well in Scotland. That's sort of about the only insider information I get, that Labour is actually doing surprisingly well north of the border. And so that scenario, well, as you said, our crystal balls are cloudy. Who knows where we'll be in a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. But that part of any future deal sort of receded a little bit in my thinking.
Okay, so one final question back there. Short.
We've heard
what you think might be proposed to correct it.
Did you hear that question, Jim? Because I think that you are the person who made that statement. Because I don't
Well, I
think
did.
the current system is unfair.
I'm sorry, you don't think it's unfair?
No, but please, yes, I have a peculiar notion of justice.
Yeah, socialism is what the Labor Party does, I think, is the uncle of that view of fairness. I think any electoral system which on identical vote distributions gives 371 seats to one party and 205 seats to another party in the same position is an electoral system that isn't fair. I think the question from the audience about what do you do about that is actually sufficiently hard that we'll still be here in a couple of hours if we try to tackle it seriously. The reason it's hard is that part of the problem with bias is different sizes of constituencies, and you can fix that just by equalizing constituency sizes. But there are a lot of other things that get into the equation which the geographers all study about regional distributions of strength and propensities of people to vote in safe seats and stuff like that. And all those things differ, and all those things are actually factors in the bias. So what I will say as a political scientist, in theory, because that makes it easy, is you simply set yourself the goal of drawing a set of boundaries that gives you an unbiased electoral system. And it turns out that those constituencies won't be equal in size, and while they won't look as bad as the whatever it is district in North Carolina, which snakes 3/4 of the way around the state on its way to delivering a black majority, some of the constituencies will look a little strange. But it will produce an electoral system which will, without, and we didn't even talk about this, but without going over to PR, which would have enormous costs in terms of the responsiveness that the Brits love, that you get a majority government out of a plurality vote. Without jettisoning that by going to PR, you can get an electoral system that treats the parties even-handedly, and I think everyone would agree that that's worth going after, even if it would take a packed Lords, a gerrymandered boundary commission, and who knows, maybe even some payoffs on the side.
All right, thank you so much. Before I thank our panelists, there are a number of other people I want to thank. It is very nice to see our General Consul from the UK here. Phil Budden is here, so I appreciate his presence. Here at CES, I want to thank Paul, who put all the technical stuff together, Jason and Sarah, and at Freshfields, Jackie. I also want to thank all of our audience. I want to thank our alumni for being here, and most of all, I want to thank our panelists, Jim Alt from the UK, Peter Hall, Dick Rosecrance, and our host in London, Don Guiney. So thanks all so much. And this is an election party, so we have PIMs and all kinds of stuff upstairs. And I invite you to join and watch the BBC as it brings some returns. So thanks so much for coming. And thank you all over there in the UK.
Thank you.